made the brave effort to come out and this meeting. My name is Peter Davidson. I'm the group coordinator for the local group of Unlock Democracy and Make Votes Count. It does actually still exist under that title, working title. And we're a small but dedicated band of defenders of democracy, I suppose would be the best way to describe us. We are here to facilitate dialogue and engagement of the public with the democratic political process, because we support democracy and we want to see its foundations sort of advanced. Obviously there's a lot of debate about how that might happen, which is the purpose of this meeting, which is under the title Manchester1partystate, because all the trends indicate that after the 22nd of May election that's forthcoming for the City of Manchester, every single councillor would have been elected under one single party ticket. Okay. Our speakers are Andrew Burns, ex-chair of the Electoral Reform Society and current Labour leader of Edinburgh City Council, who can obviously give us a very first-hand experience account of life under STV in Scotland. Kevin Peel, who is an elected city councillor for the City Centre Ward, City of Manchester Council, and Andy Mycock, who is a reader in politics at Huddersfield University, specialising in the topic of democratic participation. So all of our speakers are, they know their stuff, shall we say. Okay, thank you very much. I'm just going to give you a very, very quick backdrop, visual backdrop of what's happened over the last electoral cycle in the City of Manchester. Let's say we picked City of Manchester because it's an extreme example where every single seat will have been elected in one single party. But this trend is repeated elsewhere across wards, individual wards, in other councils, and we believe it's a problem elsewhere. But we're just giving you a quick visual summary of what's happened over the last few years, the last sort of cycle, which started in 2010. Sorry? There you go, that's it, thank you very much. So you can see, obviously, in 2010, the election, those basically, the votes cast, councillors elected, and how the council was made up. And then 2011, you can see that again there was a fair amount of voting for other parties other than Labour. All the councillors being elected were one single party, and you can see how it's shrinking. And then what's what we believe is going to happen in 2014 on May 22nd. There is a quick summary, a visual summary of how it's changed over the cycle and what we believe will happen in 2014. And all the data was compiled by Keith, a local supporter who's into election results and what have you. And just a quick hurrah for Henry Cooper. Now you can ask who Henry Cooper is. Henry Cooper is the official opposition to the City of Manchester Council now, because he was elected under Labour in Boston Ward, but he resigned from party whip in a couple of years back over a local planning dispute. He now stands as an independent Labour councillor. So he is the opposition member, so let's hear it for Henry. Okay, thank you very much. I'm going to have to get it spinned off the thing, off the screen. Okay, thank you very much. So, but Andy maybe will be able to give us a little bit of academic perspective on that process that's happened over that cycle.
Yeah, I'm not so sure it's academic, more a sort of scene setting, really. I think the figures are stark enough on their own. It's refreshing that Unlocked Democracy are holding this event so soon after what was seen to be the decimation of the electoral reform case after the 2011 referendum. And in a way it's important as we're going forward to a period of intense electoral activity. Not only got the local and Euro elections coming up, but obviously the Scottish independence referendum in September, and then the 2015 general election, whether that'll be the UK or the UK general election, is something to obviously be decided itself. But we are going forward to a period of intense electoral activity over the next year, and I think it's going to not only shine a light on the political profiles of the main political parties, but also it's going to shine a light on electoral engagement with people and how many people are going to turn out and love to vote in these various elections. In one way, I think the terms of the debate need to be slightly moderated. I don't think that Manchester is ever in danger of becoming a one-party state, as much as some might see it, in as much as a one-party state is one where one single party stands for power, and where a constitution limits or restricts completely the competition of other parties. That isn't the situation in Manchester. What we have is a de facto situation where we have a dominant party system and a dominant party city. And as someone who lives in Chiltern, I'm fully aware as a citizen of this fine city as well as a commentator of the problems of that. But as Richard Leese has quite rightly said, this doesn't mean that we're living in a one-party state. It is a democratic election. What has clearly changed, though, has been the way in which voters are interacting with the local government infrastructure or not interacting, as the case may be. And I think that the lack of interaction in some ways is one of the key issues. Manchester's not unique. This isn't a Manchester phenomenon. It's happening across the country. And it's not particularly something which is a northern issue. It's not simply northern Labour councils which are dominating this. You see in the south of the country, Conservative councils are producing similar phenomena. So in that sense, we need to be careful. I think what Manchester does provide us with, though, is a clear case study which is interesting both as a social scientist, but also if anyone has got interest in politics. I think it's interesting that Andrew's on the panel tonight, because of course what it is also is a phenomenon which is largely defined to England. It's a product in many ways of Labour's devolution, in that England's local government arrangements, and those of Wales to a lesser extent, have been left, whilst others in the parts of the United Kingdom have reformed that. What are the reasons behind this one-party phenomenon? Well, I think to a certain extent it is the regionalisation of party politics. We are becoming a more divided nation, and I talk of England rather than the United Kingdom more widely. And that regionalisation is a product largely of national political party politics as much as it is local political party politics. It is also the way in which national political institutions are relating to local government and their reluctance to devolve power of any significance, which is producing this disconnect in many ways. It's also about the current electoral arrangements, though, and I think that the first past the post system is being seen to be part of the problem in this one-party phenomenon, if we want to call it that. It's not only in terms of representation. Those particular figures are stark, and there's little evidence to suggest that that phenomenon is not going to continue in the next cycle. But it's also in the fact that turnout in Manchester is significantly depressed, even when compared to the national averages. The averages of local turnouts have varied between, in 1998, a low point of 28%, and it now runs at around 10% higher than that. Not particularly edifying when compared to our European counterparts. It is a product of that lack of power and empowerment of local government that there has been such a disconnect. At the same point, in the 2011 cycle, Manchester's average turnout was 31%. In the last cycle, 2012, it was 25%. So even in the context of a depressed national average, Manchester does stand out. If you then take into consideration Lucy Powell's sweep into power on an enormous 18% turnout, you would say that Manchester might have a potential problem in democratic engagement and voters turning out. And in that sense, political parties need to be bold. My starting point is that political parties need to accept that they are part of the problem as well as part of the solution, that many of those general disconnection issues have been a product of party politics as much as it has been about the electoral system more widely. And there is a need to accept that there is urgent need for reform of those electoral systems. They need to get over the fear that possibly their strongholds on local governments such as Manchester will not be compromised significantly by reform of electoral systems, and that in fact it could empower them to gain within those deserts, those areas of the country in which they're not succeeding. That's a problem that goes out to all the three main parties across the United Kingdom, but also in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland on a more localised level. I think more than that, they've got a responsibility to look at new ways to re-engage citizens in politics. It isn't simply about power, it isn't simply about trying to gain power. You've got a responsibility as politicians to ensure there's a vibrant political environment in which people engage. The political culture itself needs to be re-energised, and if political parties don't live up to that responsibility and are obsessed by power and power alone, then they will find that that disconnect between citizens, institutions, political parties will simply increase. In many ways, it's a good time to talk about reform, because if many people thought that in 2011 the door had been shut on reform, well, the evidence would suggest since 2011 actually that although AV wasn't a particularly appealing option, that there is a desire for reform of the political system. The recent Hansard Society audit of political engagement indicated that actually levels of political knowledge and interest in politics is growing, particularly amongst younger people. And that's the area which I work on most, is looking at youth citizenship. Young people are undertaking citizenship education, they are aware of the broader political environment, and we as a society are engaged in politics. And the evidence is there. What we're not doing is engaging with formal politics, with voting, with joining political parties. And so there seems to be a disconnect, and part of that issue might be around this political system itself. The Electoral Reform Society itself has continued its good work in campaigning for reform, and a survey they undertook in 2013 indicated that over half the people, 52% of the people who polled, are interested in reforming the political system. They might not have liked what was on offer in 2011, but there is an interest in reforming that. And I think in that sense it's interesting that we have got two such interesting speakers, in that in some ways you will be considered to be part of the problem of the one-party state, but I'm aware that you are more open to the idea that there is a potential for a discussion, a debate about this. And Andrew has experience of campaigning in both the first past the post system and in the STV system in Scotland. And I think both our speakers today will bring different perspectives to that, which will show that there are different conversations that are on shared themes in England, Scotland, and the rest of the United Kingdom. So I think I shall start by opening with Andrew, if that's okay. Andrew will start, and then Kevin, if you'd like to respond on.
Okay, thanks very much, Andy. I'll stand up if that's alright, so if they can see me, and more importantly, hear me. If I speak at this type of volume, but you can hear me at the back alright. Yeah. So thanks for the introduction, Andy. It's a real pleasure to be down here in Manchester this evening. You can see that I've bought the permanent Edinburgh sunshine, and so it's very good to be here. And I have to start with a terrible confession, just in case there's any dubiety about this, that like Kevin, I am also a Labour councillor. But I have been elected, as I'll come on to say, for 4 terms now. In my 4th term, I've been elected twice under first past the post and twice under STVs. But I'll say a little bit about that and more in a second. Now, we don't have any local authority elections, none at all, on the 22nd of May next Thursday in Scotland, because we have all unitary authorities and we're all out on the same day. We don't actually go back to the polls for local council elections until the first Thursday in May, I'm grateful to say, 2017, so I am going to outlive Barack Obama. So we're in a 5-year term from 12 to 17, so we have no local elections. We have European elections, obviously, on the 22nd. But as Andy touched on, there is another electoral event happening this year in Scotland, which is going to have huge ramifications, not just obviously for Scotland, but for the rest of the UK. And you might be interested, Andy, I'm sure you know this, that 16-year-olds are going to have the vote in that election. And I think as some of you know in the audience, I've actually got a 16-year-old who's going to get the vote in September. He's absolutely delighted about having the vote, but there's a massive irony that he's not 17 till December, so he'll vote in September in the referendum on the constitutional future of his country. And then a few months later, in May 2015, he won't be able to vote for the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. It's just crazy. And I think the dam is now burst, and we are going to have to see a reduction of the 16-year-old vote for all elections, I personally feel. And I also wanted just to start by saying, Andy, that if there's one thing that frustrates Scottish people just now. It's English politicians coming up to Scotland and telling them what to do and what to think in terms of the referendum. So I'm a little bit anxious about being a Scottish politician and coming down here to Manchester and telling you how wonderful STV is. But so I'm not in any way wanting to claim that the Scottish local government experience that I'm about to explain to you in the next 20 minutes or so is completely applicable to England. I don't want to claim that. I'm not claiming that moving to STV or any other form of PR is a panacea. It's not, and I'll say a bit more about that in wrapping up at the end. But I do want just to lay out my experience of being elected twice under first past the post and twice under STV, and leave you to make up your minds. Now, clearly I am, as Peter said in the introduction, pro STV because I was chair of the Electoral Reform Society for several years. So I'm openly admitting my bias. But I have experienced both systems, and I just want to let you know, hear my experience, and you can make up your own minds as to whether you think you want to stick, it's preferable to stick first past the post or to move towards some form of proportional representation. My preference, if you forgive the pun, would be to go to STV. So my objective is just to do that, to give you the sort of benefit of my experience over the course of the last 15 years now. As I say, I was first elected in 1999. So a little quiz first. Hands up, anybody in the room who at any level has been elected at any time by first past the post. There's 4 or 5. Hands up, anybody in the room who at any level has been elected by STV. In a public election.
It was right.
It wasn't.
Foundation Trust.
Foundation Trust. So it's just always interesting to, usually you get many more people who are elected on the first past the post in the UK than under STV, so it's interesting to see that a few, like myself, have been elected under STV, so I'm not sure that's a good start for the rest of my talk, Andy, or not. But anyhow, I'm going to try and split what I want to say into 3 sort of short chunks. I want just to say a little bit about my own background about the 4 elections that I've gone through. I want to say, secondly, a little bit about the political implications of that experience that I've been through, not just for Edinburgh, but across the whole of Scotland. And then a little bit about the potential implications for all of that down here in England. And then Kevin might want to pick up on some of the points I make. So just first of all, a little bit about the background of my own electoral history. So as I've already indicated, I first stood for election in 1999. So that was when devolution came into force. There was a lot of councillors in Scotland at the time who became MSPs, members of the Scottish Parliament. I didn't have a game plan, there was just a big churn of councillors becoming elected to the Holyrood Parliament in 1999, first Thursday of May 1999. And I was persuaded to stand for the local council in Edinburgh, and I stood, and to my surprise got elected. And so in that first term, it was to start with, it was a fixed 4-year term, so from 1999 to 2003, and then again I got elected from 2003 to 2007 under first past the post. So there was a Labour Liberal Democrat Scottish government at Holyrood, and in 2004, so it took them more than the first term of the Parliament, because it was on a fixed 4-year as well. In 2004 they legislated, the Labour Liberal Democrat coalition government legislated, because local government, as Andy said, was totally devolved to Scotland. They legislated to introduce STV PR for local council elections. So that came into force in 2007. So in 1999, I was in a single-party majority Labour council, so I went straight into power. We had there's 58 councils, so it's a bit smaller than Manchester. I think about 96 here. And we had 58 councils, and we had 55%, over half of the elected councillors on the council, on 32% of the vote. Because we've been running Edinburgh since 1984, and those of you who know Edinburgh will know, with a small C, it's a very conservative city. And it had been run by the Conservatives for decades, if not centuries, prior to 1984. And at the sort of height of Thatcherism, Labour got control, and it held control all the way, as I'm about to say, until 2007. But our percentage vote was coming down and down and down, because we had a large, at the time, 1999, remember, a large Liberal Democrat opposition, given what I've just said about Edinburgh, a large Conservative group as well. And no SNP councillors, I think there was 1 SNP councillor at the time. So 32% of the vote, but we got a majority of the seats. And being tribalist for a second, that was bloody marvellous. You know, I was straight into power, and within 2 years I was given an executive post in a cabinet system. I was responsible for transport, so the trams are my fault. And then we got re-elected in 2007, but it got, you know, depending on your viewpoint, it got better or worse. You know, we got 51% of the seats, so we had 30 of the 58 seats, I think just over 50. But our vote percentage had gone down to 27%. So we were clinging on by the skin of our teeth. And again, being tribalist for a second, it was great. We were still a majoritarian party, and we carried on, ran the city, a majority party, a single party control, carried on running the city, and I was in transport for most of that time, and I had education for a little while as well, in the run up to 2007. And I have to say, what we completely failed to do was plan properly, and you know, I'm not being slightly defensive about myself here, but I wasn't the group leader or the council leader at the time. I was a executive member. But what we failed to do, and I've got to share some responsibility for this, we failed to plan for what we all knew was coming, which was PR. And knowing full well we only had 27% of the vote, and we didn't open channels to the other parties, and I look back on it and I think, how bloody stupid was that? You know? So what happened in 2007 was we got 22% of the vote, carried on going down again, and we got, lo and behold, had the rest of EPR, 23% of the seats. And we were second. The Liberal Democrats came first, we were second, and the third biggest party, because of the introduction of PR, was the SNP. They did fantastically well electorally out of PR, and so they should have done, because they knew everybody got their respective percentages in terms of seats, in rough percentage terms, in correlation to the percentage of the vote. So because we then run the city from 84 to 2007, the inevitable happened. The first party and the third party did a deal, so there was a Liberal Democrat SNP coalition, and we were turfed out. So having campaigned, as again several people in the audience know, long and hard for the introduction of STV in Scotland, what was the first thing that happened to me upon its introduction? I got lobbed into opposition. So, you know, I could be bitter about this, but I'm not. I mean, it was a really salutary experience, and you know, I'm a Labour politician, you know, I'm a pluralist, but I have my moments of tribalism, like everybody else, no matter what your party is, and I did not enjoy being in opposition. And in 2008, I became the opposition group leader, so I wasn't any time up until 2008 the group leader. So I became the opposition group leader in 2008, and I made an abs, because the then opposition leader, who was the council leader, stayed on until 2012, but he just wanted to stand back. So I became opposition leader, so I had 4 years, because by that stage it had gone to a 5-year term, so it was 7 to 12, and it's now 12 to 17. So I had 4 years as opposition group leader, and I was determined not to do what we had done to the Liberal Democrats and the Tories from 1999 to 2007, which was completely bloody well ignored, and not to do what even under PR, the SNP and the Liberal Democrats, I consider, made a big mistake. They just excluded us. So even under, I have to say, even under SNP-PR in that first term, because the culture wasn't changed greatly, we still felt like we were marooned in opposition, but we had no say, no committee chairs, no executive posts. So I guess I'm acknowledging that just changing your electoral system won't automatically change your political culture. But I was determined when I became opposition leader to make sure that if I did get into a position of power again, that I wouldn't repeat that same cycle, that pattern. And luckily for me, in 2012, we got 24% of the seats, roughly. I mean, I'd have to double check some of these minor percentages, and we got about 26, 27% of 24% of the vote, 26, 27% of the seats. So we've got 20 councillors. We were first, so there was a group of 20 Labour councillors and 18 SNP, so they were second. Conservatives were third. Greens have got a big group in Edinburgh, 6 were fourth. Liberal Democrats were decimated post 2010, I have to say, unfortunately, in some ways, from their perspective, obviously. But so there's only 3 of them. So we've still got 5 groups, you know, because a group of 2 is a collection of 2 is a group in the Scottish local councils. So we've got 5 groups. But what happened this time was that I struck a deal between the first party, Labour, and the SNP, the second party. And having spent, you know, I forgot to say in 2007, the Lib Dem SNP coalition was 29 councillors, and the collective opposition of Labour, Conservative and Green was 29. But they had the Lord Provost, which is the sort of council chair, mayor, whatever, not directly elected, But it was trench warfare for 5 years because it was a 29-29 split. That didn't help the culture change either. But doing your maths, obviously, 20 Labour, 18 SNP, 38 out of 58, so it was 30 against 20 opposition, but a majority of 18. I could lose a minibus full of Labour councillors and still run the council. So, and joking aside, that has made a huge difference because there isn't that, I mean, it's absolutely, I mean, I will have no excuse whatsoever not to deliver on my manifesto or our coalition programme because we've got such a big majority. And that hasn't been the case since 1999. So we formed the Labour SNP coalition, which wasn't universally popular in our own party, I have to say, given what's just about to happen in September. And at the time, it was the only Labour SNP coalition in the 32 local authorities in Scotland. There's now another one in Dumfries and Galloway, following a change in power. So that's the process I've been through. And I should also say, as I think probably most of you know, that the STV wards in Scotland are just 3 and 4. It's slightly different from Southern Ireland, which is 5 member wards, I think 4 to 5. We're just 3 to 4 under legislation. So the sort of deal that was done at the Scottish Government level between the Lib Dems and Labour was to go for STVPR but to keep it to 3 to 4 member wards. So it's not hugely different in some ways in the multi-member ward ways than the job that Kevin's got. You know, because I'm in a 3-member ward, I think you probably was working. You know, so there's 3 of us, it just happens that I've got Labour, Green and SNP, whereas you're probably through Labour.
Not yet.
Not yet. But in terms of your representation, your responsibility, your connection with the ward, I mean, I really have to say, in all sincerity, and I'm not just saying this because I am pro-STV, you'll get people saying the reverse, but my experience is you are more accountable, because I often hear it being said about STV that in a multi-member ward you're not as directly accountable with that single-member ward link. It's rubbish. I think you're much more accountable. I have got an extremely active Green councillor in my ward, a fairly active SNP councillor in my ward, and between 2007 and 2012 when I was in opposition, I had a very active Conservative councillor in my ward, who really do keep me on my toes, and even now as council leader, I have to watch my back all the time at a ward level, and that's a good thing. Politicians don't, they're always asking everybody else to be competitive, they don't like it themselves, and I think it's a really good thing. So that's the sort of picture of what's happened in Edinburgh, and I have remained, despite being turfed into opposition, despite having those 5 years in the wilderness, I have absolutely remained completely convinced that STVPR is a better way to operate a local authority at a local authority level. We've got 5 parties, roughly representative going to the vote. We've managed to form a very stable, in very difficult political circumstances. I'm sure that you've explained this to you. You can imagine the tensions that we've got. But we've just got an agreement to keep the constitutional question out of the chambers. And we're delivering local services, for goodness sake, we're not running the country. So we're managing it, but I'm not going to say it doesn't have its moments, it does. But it's working fine. And the other thing I've done, this goes back to your point, Andy, about just cultural change. We really have gone out of our way not to do to the now opposition, which is primarily Conservative, Green and Lib Dem, what they did to us and what we did to them back in 1999 to 2003. So the main scrutiny committee is chaired by a Conservative councillor, even though we've got a massive majority, we could have taken that post ourselves. We've set up a petitions committee, which is chaired by one of the Green councillors, which we didn't have to give away, and all the other group leaders, I think, started off with an SRA, a responsibility allowance. So we have ceded power, even though we've got 38 out of 58, and we didn't have to do that. And that hasn't been as a result of STVPR. I'm not suggesting that for a second. It's been a part of the package that I've tried to deliver, of not just having electoral change, but trying to push forward the cultural change. And you know, we have argy-bargy in the chambers, I'm sure they do in Manchester, even though they're all obviously Labour. But in the main, the culture has shifted greatly, and if nothing else in 2017, I'm optimistic that what comes after me, and it might not be me, that we don't revert to what was before, the sort of very, very yardly politics that we had. And I just wanted briefly, Andy, to say, you know, it's not just similar like that in Edinburgh. I mean, you mentioned this yourself, that we're down south in England, it's the Conservatives that dominate certain councils. You know, in Angus, in the north east of Scotland, the SNP under first past the post completely dominated the council, and we were getting big percentage votes, Labour, Scottish Labour, with no representation. We've now got a big Labour group on Angus Council, and there is hope for Manchester, even if you go for STVPR, because in Glasgow, as many of you will know, even after 2 STD elections, Scottish Labour have managed to hold on to an overall majority because they get 45+% of the vote. So, in Manchester, if that was to be replicated, you would get Manchester Labour would get an overall majority potentially, I would suggest, because you're getting about 61% of the vote. And that's not as much as Glasgow Labour. So even with, because you get roughly, sort of 45 plus, you'll get a majority. And I just wanted to move on to sort of some of the other implications, so not just the local stuff in Edinburgh, because you'll often hear, particularly among Labour audiences and Labour activists, that it's been a terrible disaster for Scottish Labour, STV, and again, it's complete rubbish. It's complete rubbish. In 1999, even under first past the post, we had 15 councils that we ran, so we had 15 council leaders. In 2003, it had gone down to 13. Admittedly, in 2007, so that's the first STV election, it went down to 11. So we did not do well with that initial transition to STV, much like in Edinburgh. We got kicked out in a few places. In 2012, how many council leaders have we got in Scotland out of 32? 16. We've never had more. So under STVPR, now I'm not going to stand here and say they're all majoritarian, because if you're looking at one, I'm not a single party council leader, I have to depend on SNP votes. But we've got 16, most of you in the room probably know how important it is to have the council leaders post. It's pretty powerful, especially in big cities. We've got 16 of them in Scotland. We've never had that since the onset of devolution. So it hasn't damaged the political power that Scottish Labour's got at a local level. And anybody tells you otherwise, you need to challenge them to turf up the evidence and not just be spouting rhetoric, because the evidence proves that whilst we might have a fewer number of councillors overall in Scotland, numerically the whole number has gone down, we've actually got better representation, like you were suggesting, Andy. It's more evenly spread. We've got councillors in Angus, we've got council leaders in places like Dumfries and Galloway where we wouldn't necessarily have had them. And yes, they might be in a coalition, but it's been good for Scottish Labour. And I would suggest, dare I suggest as a Scot in Manchester, it could be good for Manchester Labour as well, and for English Labour across the whole of the country. So the wider, I guess, potential implications beyond just Edinburgh, Scotland and England, just generally, I do think it's important, and I'm always very frank about this, not to overclaim for what STV or any other PR system can do, because it will not revolutionise your turnout. It just will not do it. I was interested, Andy, what you were saying about turnout. I didn't know those figures. In Scotland, you probably gathered from what I said about 99, 03, 07, we went to the polls on the same day local councils as Scottish Parliament, so it's very hard to say what our turnout was because it was boosted. But in 2012, it was that 5-year term was to split it from the Scottish Parliament. So in 2012, I mean, I'm feeling good about this now, given you've just told me about 20% in Manchester. We had a 42% turnout on a standalone council election. And the last standalone council election in Scotland was 1995, pre-devolution, and it was 44%. So it's only gone down by 2, it has gone down though. So STV hasn't miraculously boosted the turnout, and I think pro-PR people shouldn't claim it because it won't automatically do it. But neither has it seen a collapse in turnout. It won't dissipate all political conflict. We still have political conflict in our chamber. You have to drive through other cultural change to go alongside it. And I think, hopefully I've indicated that the period from 3 to 7 in Edinburgh, that political, 7 to 12, that period from 7 to 12 in Edinburgh, the first period of STVPR, the culture didn't change because there wasn't the political will to change the culture. All your democratic ills aren't going to be solved. The poverty is not going to be automatically finished, and the planet's not going to be saved. STVPR will not do these things. But absolutely what it will do, and I hope I've evidenced this, is more of the votes will count, so you'll get roughly, not exactly, a proportionate amount of seats to the vote you get in percentage terms. But most importantly, there's more choice for voters. Everybody in my ward feels like they've got something, with the possible exception of the Conservative voters, because they just lost out. But they had a Conservative councillor in the last term, so they know that they can get back in again, I'm absolutely sure. But all your choices will count. If you don't like Andrew Burns, you quite like Edinburgh Labour, you can vote number 1 for Joe Bloggs or Josephine Bloggs, and vote number 2 for Andrew Burns, or vice versa. In a 4-member ward, we stand 2 Labour councillors, And if it's Andrew Burns and Kevin Peel, and you just don't like Andrew Burns, you can vote number 1 for Kevin Peel, miss out Andrew Burns and vote number 2 for somebody else. So it puts much more power into the hands of the voters. And I therefore think it does make inclination to vote stronger, but I wouldn't overclaim what it's going to do for turnout. I think it strengthens the link between the ward member and their constituents. I don't think it weakens it in any way, shape or form. I think it's the other way around. And councils, I hope I really have proven this, are much more representative. And it doesn't automatically lead to a diminution in power. So Andy, that's my sort of 20 minutes up. I hope I've given you a little flavour for some of what I've experienced under First Past the Post, some of what I've experienced under SDVPR. I think it's been a much better system. It's not a panacea for all political ills, but I think it's a massive step in the right direction. And I really, really hope that Labour at UK level, we're really talking about the Westminster Parliamentary Party here, do something with the manifesto in the run-up to 2015 that enables at least something to happen in English local authorities. Because I think the evidence from Scotland, I'm sure if you had a councillor standing here from Northern Ireland, they would be saying the same. It's overwhelmingly positive. Not 100% perfect, but it's overwhelmingly positive, and it does refresh local democracy. And certainly for us in Edinburgh, it refreshed our party. It stopped us taking voters for granted. It refreshed our connection, and we got back into power. We got back into power. My desolation in 2007 was salved by the time we got to 2012 because we embraced it. We learned how better to campaign with the system, and we won. Okay, we've had to form a coalition. And we've changed the culture, and I think that could happen in Manchester if Manchester had a single transferable vote. Thanks very much for listening.
Thank you very much, that's superb. It's interesting actually, if you look at the 2011 Scottish Parliament turnout, that also dropped.
Yeah.
So, you know, there was across the board, I don't think it was anything really to do with STP. And in a way, if you look at the spike of turnout in 2010 in Manchester, that was also connected to the fact that it was run on the same day as the general election. I think it reached over 60% then. I've got a number of questions, but I think it's probably better to get Kevin to come up and maybe respond in some ways, or talk about some of the issues that you think about Manchester which are of relevance.
Yeah, sure. I'm not being rude, I've got my notes on my phone, so that's why I'm sort of checking my Twitter or anything. So, I didn't, that'd be hard for me that, by the way. I didn't prepare a big speech because I knew that Andrew was going first, and I suspected he would steal lots of my best lines, which he has. But I think what you said was very interesting because as a supporter of electoral reform, I don't know if I'm not meant to be, to make this a bit more interesting, and I can argue that the opposite if you like, but it hadn't been put to me in such a positive way before. But as you were speaking and you were talking about having this Green councillor in your ward and this SNP councillor in your ward, and I was imagining going to the Labour group and proposing this and saying, well, 2/3 you can lose. I think it's going to be an uphill task. But then it got better at the end. You should lead maybe with the winning and having the more councils now than we had before. I think that's probably a much better one for us to go on. I think there's a kind of a few points. No, I'll start with a bit more Manchester. So I don't need to explain the system because you all live here, so everybody understands it already. And clearly from the charts that we were shown, it isn't particularly democratic. We got a pretty impressive percentage of the vote, 66% I think, which is quite impressive, and obviously would result in us leading the council in any case. But we're probably not going to do much better than 66% this time, and obviously end up with no opposition councillors apart from poor old Henry, who I'm sure will take his new position with gusto. So there is a real problem there, isn't there, with the people in my ward, in another ward, who are voting for the parties and are going to have, or in theory are going to have their voices heard. I mean, I think that's kind of not one of the best arguments because obviously we represent everybody, and I know there are a number of Liberal Democrats and Tories in particular in my own ward who who contact us regularly about issues, and some actually who we've managed to convince to vote for us. So we must be doing all right. I don't know. I have the distinction. Our local MP Lucy Powell has the distinction of having the worst electoral turnout in history. She was desperately hoping she would be beaten by Mike Cain in Wythenshawe, but alas it was not to be. He did slightly better. And I have the distinction of having the lowest turnout in any ward in Manchester. And I'm going to explain a little bit about that, because I don't think, or I hope it isn't because we're rubbish. It's the city centre ward, so it is all private rented apartments. 50% of our electorate are students who are just there for the course of the student year, and then are out to houses in Withington where they become somebody else's problem. Another sort of 25 to 30% are people who come in for work projects or short-term study periods or whatever, and are gone after 6 months. And by the time we write to them, by the time we get the updated register and white to welcome them, we get them all sent back saying no longer at this address. So it's incredibly difficult to engage and to find those people that are the longer-term residents. So that we're doing a pretty good job of it, I think. And so our turnout, I think, in 2012 was about 13%, 14%, which is appalling. But we do a lot to try and turn that around. I'm hoping it will be a little better this time, and the Euros will certainly help. So we put out, I think, quite good leaflets, and we put out 4 of those a year to every flat. We put out regular letters about casework issues, and we make sure that we notify residents about licensing and planning issues, probably to the tune of 10 or 12,000 letters a year, I think, in the last year certainly. We do a fortnightly community meeting where we will write to 500 or 600 flats and invite them to a meeting within a couple of minutes walk of their flat, where they can meet their councillors and talk about issues. Out of that 600 we'll normally get 6, but it's better than nothing. So we try really, really hard, and I think some of the as a supporter of electoral reform, I get frustrated by some of the campaigning around it, which sort of I don't like, for example, sorry Darren, the rotten borough stuff, and I don't like some of the suggestions that we're somehow lazy and not doing the job. I think overwhelmingly that isn't the case, and you will have councillors as frustrated as all of you with the turnout and the engagement and the participation, and doing lots of things to try and change that. But inevitably, I think the electoral system is certainly part of the issue. But there are three really, really important things that I want to stress that are the most important things to me in any debate about democratic reform and engagement and participation. So the first is the quality, the effectiveness and the diversity of representation. So how can we get the best possible people standing for council and doing the best job, and have them representing the wider community? I think particularly the Labour Party is getting better at that, with some of the things that we've done, for example, with the shortlists for parliamentary elections. We have equal gender balancing in the European lists, so we will probably have 2 women and 1 man elected for Labour in the North West this time. The Conservatives, by contrast, in the North West have got 2 women out of 8 on their list, and UKIP, I think, have got 1. And in local government as well, we have 50% plus 1 of all seats that are up that are open each year are women, and we're slowly, I don't know what it is, 30, somewhere between 30 and 40% women. It'll be closer to 40 or over 40 after these elections, and so we're getting there. And in our executive, we have I think a minimum of a third. Is the new rule that we put in last year. So I think we're doing pretty good by some of the stuff that we've implemented on that. But of course, there can be more to do. So I think the question around that, to throw out and have as part of the discussion, is: will changing the voting system increase the quality and effectiveness and diversity of candidates? It's one of the claims. I don't know necessarily whether just changing the voting system will do that, but I think it's something to think about. The second that I think is really important is the engagement in and participation in the political process by the electorate, which is, I think, pretty depressing and dwindling. And we launched we had our own ward manifesto, And also we've got a city-wide manifesto, and we had a launch on Saturday with the leader of the council and with our local MP, Lucy, and with myself and with our candidate. We had a venue that could fit 70 people in, and we sent a letter, a named and addressed direct mail letter to 5,000 people in our ward and the 850 that are on our email list. And I think there were, taking out speakers, 8 people. You know, now, is that because people aren't interested? Is it because they don't like, you know, it's a difficult one to comprehend because, as I say, there are 800 and odd people on our email list, which is over a third of the people who actually turn out and vote in local elections in our ward, which I think is pretty good. And they're contacting us and they know who we are and where we are, and you know, and they get regular emails about what we're up to and invited to events and all the rest of it. So they're interested in on some level, I mean, Andy, you were talking about how people engage in issues but not sort of political parties, and I think that's a really interesting one and important one, particularly in terms of young people. And so, for example, Lucy's office will get lots and lots of emails through things like 38 Degrees from primarily, not necessarily, but like quite a lot of young people are engaging in sort of the political process in that way, but then aren't engaging when they're invited to events or when they're asked for their opinions about other issues by their MP or by their councillor. And I just don't know there is definitely a disconnect. I don't know quite what it is in some areas where we're really trying hard to fix it. And the question again is how can changing the voting system change that, I think, because we just talked about turnout. Slightly better. I think the average in 2012 in Scotland was 39%, and it was 31% in England. It's 25% in Manchester, which is appalling, but it was 31% in Liverpool, and it was 32% in Liverpool, and 32% in Glasgow. So it was comparable. And I don't think Liverpool are doing anything that we're not doing in Manchester. We've got a very good Labour council, and they're very active, and they're looking at us with envy as we win all the seats because they're not doing that, but they're campaigning hard. But I don't know what I think looking at that and seeing the sort of comparable turnout suggests that isn't really a significant claim. The third thing I'm interested in is about the distribution of power and how, and this is very much linked to the engagement of participants in the process, but is how we can get more power in local government and then give it away. And this is something I'm particularly interested in, is about having decisions made at the lowest possible level, and that should be even lower than the council, I think, because in terms of sort of community empowerment, and I think that can have a really positive impact on engagement and participation. Because actually, if we organise a meeting to talk about, I don't know, the licensing, say bars in the northern quarter, then we'll have a dozen people or a couple of dozen people come, and people in that very, very local sense, people are really directly engaged and want to be involved, and we have a lot of success with those very, very local campaigns. And I think part of the disillusionment and part of that disconnect is when people, for example, whether it's a planning thing and residents really sort of join together and campaign against something, and then the council will go another way. I think that can contribute to that, and whether we can move some of those decisions local, closer to people, and sort of better reflect their views in that. And so I think there's a whole thing around power and getting more power, but I think that can't come without reforming the democratic system, because I think it is. I'm quite worried actually with local government getting more power as it is at the moment, and so we're seeing some funding decisions and some powers devolved, for example, to the Greater Manchester Combined Authority, which most people will have not heard of. I don't even really understand it, to be honest, and I'm a councillor, but that is the leaders of the 10 authorities in Greater Manchester, and they make quite a lot of decisions, and it's not. I don't think it's particularly open or transparent, and I think it is. I think they've got to go alongside each other. So London got the mayor and it got the GLA, and then it got the sort of powers that we're seeing here now. We're not having that. We obviously had the referendum on having a mayor, a directly elected mayor for Manchester, which I supported. and I know some of my colleagues did as well, although I sort of got in trouble for supporting it a bit too loudly and publicly. But I thought it was really important, and it wasn't good. I mean, in a lot of a lot of the things this government does, so they propose AV and have a referendum, and we all know AV is a bit rubbish. They propose having direct elected mayors for a city when we need that coordination at the city region level, and then a surprise when people say no. So I think it wasn't perfect, but it would have been a good start, and it would have been a good point at which to start arguing, I think, for that wider reform that we need. So the powers have to come, I think, with the increased accountability and transparency. There's a couple of questions about STV that I want to kind of throw out, and some of the, as I say, as a supporter, but there are some of the claims I think we should look at and see whether they are really the most robust arguments that we can make. So, for example, talking about competition between councillors, I was talking with one of my council colleagues today, who is also supportive of electoral reform, who said, I mean, the problem we'd end up with is you'd have Labour councillors or councillors from other parties who would be competing with each other, obviously because they want to get in next time, and actually you disintegrate the sort of group and the cohesiveness of being part of the same party, and you'd have people hoarding bits of casework and trying to get their name out more. And so I'd be interested in how that sort of has worked in Edinburgh, because I think that's one I didn't really know the answer to, and I would be quite worried about if that happened, because I think actually what we've managed to do in Manchester. And when I talk to councillors from elsewhere, and they say, "Oh God, it must be the official opposition in the Labour group must be." Actually, we have pretty healthy and open debate in the Labour group, and there aren't big splits in that way, which I think is it's not unique, but it's probably quite surprising, especially when you think about some other councils where they're in a kind of similar situation. It doesn't seem to be the same. The other thing is about opposition itself, and this it's a partisan point, but please don't take it that this is something that I would just say on no basis, as a sort of pluralist and all the rest of it. Opposition needs to be effective, and so everyone's going to get very excited next Friday when, as is the likely outcome, we have 95 out of 96 Labour councillors. Actually, we might as well have had those for the last few years, and I'm sorry for any Lib Dems in the room, but the Liberal Democrat group of councillors in Manchester has not been an effective opposition in the last 3 years that I've been a councillor. I sit on the Neighbourhood Scrutiny Committee, which I thought only had one Lib Dem member, because I've never seen one, and only had 2 or 3 meetings out of the last year. Actually, it turns out it's got 2 or 3, I think, who never turned up. So, those scrutiny committees are really important, and opposition members aren't turning up to those. There's a Lib Dem councillor still in my ward at the moment, who we haven't seen at any ward events or ward coordination meetings, which are mandatory to attend, for at least, for the last year definitely, and then the year before that, she had an excuse because she was a Lord Mayor, but the last year we've seen absolutely nothing. And I think that is a real disservice to the people who elect you if you are not going and doing that job. You can you can sort of be sensationalist and put things in your leaflets and go to the media and say this, that, and the other. But actually, if you're not doing the work in the town hall, then I think that is unfortunate. And so, just having an opposition doesn't necessarily mean you haven't got a one-party state. You need to have an effective opposition. Now, again, does changing the voting system do that? You talk about sort of everyone being kept on their toes by that constant kind of sort of friction. I'd be interested, to see whether that's improved the quality of opposition. I think there's just a couple more things. Just one point is that I think we need to sort of take this debate wider, and it needs to be beyond just changing the voting system, and we need much wider reform. And I know a lot of democracy talk about some of this as well. I think we need to be looking at engaging with the parties on how they select candidates in the first place. Because some of that is not great, and actually you still don't really have a choice when you get to the ballot box, because the party decides who you're voting for, and most people, let's not kind of have big egos. Most people are voting for the party candidate. They're not voting for Kevin Peel or Andrew Burns, although I'm sure over your years built up many personal supporters, Andrew. But they're looking for that Labour logo, and they're putting the cross, or not in your case, but they're putting the number in that box. And so, the choice needs to go back before that. It needs to go to how we select candidates. I've long been a supporter of primaries in the Labour Party. Some form of primary. I think there are some forms that are better than others, where we can have the electorate involved before we select the candidates, so that by the time you get to the ballot box, there's already been that sort of wide involvement in that process. And I think we were sort of promised, we were sort of teased with the idea of having primaries as part of the Lord Collins review, which was this internal thing that the Labour Party did, which turned out to be a bit of a damn squib. And the only primary that we've got is for the London Mayor, which is great. I think that's disappointing though. I think we could have looked at doing that as a tester across a number of different areas to see how it worked. So selections, I think, is really important, and look at the quality. I mean, if you look at the not quick to say nice things about the Tories, but Tory MP Sarah Wollaston, who was selected in a primary, I think is just one of the most impressive backbenchers in Parliament. She often defies the whip. She speaks out very passionately on behalf of their constituents, and I think there should be a bit more of that. I think we should be a bit less slavish about sticking to party whips and lines and messaging. And I think that's part of the reason why, I'm sort of veering off on here now, it's part of the reason why people like Nigel Farage are doing so well, is because people from all the sort of traditional main parties sound so managed. I think there's really something there, but that's the subject for a different debate. I'll get myself in trouble if I say any more. So the other thing is about education, political education. So you talk about citizenship, and where it's taught well, it's very good. But of course, it isn't taught well everywhere, and it isn't even taught everywhere. And I think we really should commit to mandatory citizenship education in the curriculum for kids at school. I think that is incredibly important, and up the quality of it, and also the importance. It's not really seen as an important subject at the moment. I think we need to look at how we can improve that in terms of how it's seen by higher education and employers and others. And of course, vote at 16. I absolutely think we need to introduce vote at 16. I'm pleased the Labour Party is committed to doing that. And you're right, the floodgates are open. You can't say you can vote on the constitution of your country, but you can't vote for your local MP. I think that's bizarre. So, just lastly, there's a few things I think we can do in Manchester. So we're going to be this one-party state next week, and I agree with Andy that isn't necessarily a sort of helpful way to put it, because it is a very different situation. People have had their say, and we have got 2/3 of the votes, whether that's so I think that's important to acknowledge. But and there's a few things that we need to be really talking about in the Labour group after next Thursday, and that is back to what I said before about power and how we can devolve power to communities and take it out of the town hall. I think is really, really important, and that could be things like, for example, looking at how we can take. Obviously, there's no money because the government are gutting our budget in a most horrendous way. But how we can, the money that we have got, how we can refocus that. So, for example, rather than the highways department deciding all the roads that get fixed in a ward, let's have a kind of let's have some sort of you decide type system in wards where the public can decide, which roads get fixed or how we deal with this or that, and how money's spent on the services in their particular area. I think there are a number of councils that do interesting things around citizen assemblies or township forum type things. I think they're mostly sort of talking shops, but I think you could give them real power and they could be very effective. And we don't do that in Manchester. I think it's a real shame. I think the second thing is more robust and open scrutiny. So the scrutiny meetings are open, and they are pretty good, actually, I think. We look at everything. We look at everything before it gets agreed. We have lots of sort of spin-off groups. So, for example, I'm currently chairing a task and finish group, which sounds a bit boring. The MEN speak, a council task force on private sector housing in the city, particularly the role of letting and managing agents, and how dreadful they can be, and the horrible, services and the charges. And we, at our last meeting, we had in front of us the Managing Director of the National Landlords Association, the Chief Executive of the Association of Residential Letting Agents, and the Chief Executive of the Association of Residential Managing Agents. It's a little bit unnerving because I was there in my jeans, so I think I've sort of told them a bit this evening. But we had those people there, and we were really challenging them on their sort of views and their practices and how they could improve. and people are welcome to attend those. Now they're during the day, which is is one of the problems. So it's not an open process. It's just that sort of people, I imagine, just find it. I imagine it's quite boring. So we could look at how we can change that, and have tougher scrutiny as well, and have councillors who aren't afraid to ask very difficult questions that otherwise they might sort of not to really. I think the third thing is about engaging the public in policy making. So we've now got our manifesto for the city. I think it's quite good, but it was decided by us. We all got together and had a sort of policy forum and came up with ideas, and that was taken away by the leadership and was put into a manifesto. I think we could do a lot better than that. I think we could be looking at sort of public policy forums right across the city and asking people for their ideas, and then asking council officers to go away and cost them and look at the feasibility and look at what's done elsewhere. I think that we could really open that up and make it a much more engaging process. And finally, it's about changing the way the council works. So I just mentioned we have all of our meetings in the daytime. Dreadful if you've got a job. I really struggled. I had a full-time job very recently, and really struggled to be able to make all of the meetings that you're required to make: council meetings, scrutiny meetings, meetings with your ward coordination team, and meetings of task and finish groups and things that we end up getting involved in. So we need to look at that for a start, because it is dreadful when you've got lots of residents who want to oppose a licence application and then have to turn up at the town hall at 10:15 and then could still be there at 4 o'clock in the afternoon because it hasn't been heard yet. That just isn't really acceptable, and that really frustrates people with the process. And there's a constant feeling, that gets reported back to us often about the town hall seeming to work against the public, and that isn't true. But the processes certainly do, and I think really need changing. And I think looking at that as well could attract different people. So you have a lot of people with sort of busy full-time jobs who just aren't becoming councillors because they cannot commit to having to take a day a week off to do council work. You've got people with kids who find it really difficult. Now, actually, we've got some new mums who've been bringing their babies to full council meetings and things, which I think is really. You've got sort of all of these very sort of old, small C conservatives, gentlemen who've been on the council for 500 years. Before people had babies, and before women were allowed to become councillors, but actually it's kind of slowly changing the attitudes. I really like it, but there's there's very little support with childcare, for example. If you're a councillor and you've got a baby, I think there's a very very nominal fee which doesn't cover the current cost of childcare at all, and you have to jump through all sorts of hoops to get it. And so, there's a whole range of things about changing how the council works, I think, that we could look at. I've talked for well, I apologise. Well, that's it, I'll stop there. So we're not on one, but yeah, there we go.
I was just going to say, you talk so long, it's gone slightly dark. The sun's still with us. That blue sky's still with us. Well, thank you very much. That was wonderful. Just to bring it back onto voting itself, although I think that what you raised was absolutely right, both of you, in the fact that this isn't simply a question of electoral systems. You can't form a system and expect the culture and the way in which we engage with citizens to change magically overnight. It is a wider change of the way we view local democracy, which I think is required, the way in which institutions, political parties and representatives interact with each other and with citizens themselves. There are some lessons, I suspect, we can learn from Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, from what they've done. I think, Andrew, you were highlighting something. I think that one of the things that is clear in all the survey evidence and the research that's been done at the local level is that it has energised local politics. It has brought a greater edge of competition and innovation in terms of policy, and the need for candidates to go out and connect and engage on the stoop. And I think that's something which has been slightly lost in this debate, which tends to be focused largely on turnout alone, as if this is the beginning then. And in a way that's also a problem. Things like vote to 16, they're always connected with things like with turnout, because these are palpable, measurable things that politicians can talk to, whereas it's much more difficult to acknowledge the different effects. I think it's also interesting that that has had some impact, and it's something that you raised, Kevin, about the issue of representation. Who are these people that are coming forward in these systems? Is it changing the more stereotypical white, middle-aged male representative who is the local councillor? And the evidence is, yes, it is. It has had some impact, both at a national level, the National Assembly, the Scottish Parliament, not National Assembly, World Assembly, and at a local level in Northern Ireland and in Scotland. It has changed the background to a certain extent, particularly in terms of age and ethnicity, but not to the same extent in terms of gender. And I think that's something which is still an issue. That STV is no silver bullet to that issue. You know, you mentioned intellectualists, etc., these kinds of positive actions. I think that that's something that is about a wider political culture, that it's not yet. These are early days. You know, we can't make strong assessments on very initial evidence, but it is interesting that it has brought the age representation levels down. We are seeing younger people coming into it, although not those under the age of 30 particularly, and that it is drawing people from BME communities, but gender does seem to be the issue which is still a problem. I think there's also evidence in research about the change in political culture that both at a local and at a national level there is a greater comfort in coalition politics. And I think that's what you were discussing now. It's interesting that you can take your strongest adversary, if you want to think at an international level, the Scottish National Party, and you can form a coalition government at a local level and work very effectively. The evidence is from 2012 that is working very well. That, compared to the first past the post coalition that we're seeing in Westminster, is discernibly different. And it's clear that the first past the post system meant that, as Jeremy Paxman wanted to put it last night, you know, we've got to point now that the government, the coalition government, has run out of any real policy framework, and it is going to spend the next year trying to dissemble itself and spend more time attacking itself, each other, than it will governing the country. And I think that's something I'd be interested to hear you say more about, actually, is how that change in the way in which coalition government is approached within a different voting system. Is there a demonstrable change in that? It doesn't seem to have led to a significant change in some of the more adversarial levels and elements of political culture, and I think that's probably because of the way in which those operating with it, old dinosaurs like your good self, have got experience of the past and future, and it's difficult to, you know, to shed those in some sense. I think what we can see also is that not only is that adversarial politics, so one of the big issues which is always cited those opponents of STV and PR more widely is that it allows extremists and that it pushes politics to the extremes in some sense. The evidence in Scotland and in Wales is not that's the case. What it has done though is it's not rejected entirely the two-party approach. It has spread the voting a little bit, but it hasn't changed it demonstrably. In Northern Ireland, because of the particular circumstances in Northern Ireland, it does seem to have pushed politics to the edge. That, to a certain extent, is part of the consociational framework in Northern Ireland, which makes it distinctive. Has it made government weaker and less accountable? On the first term, there is some argument that there is elements at the national level of weakness. I don't know, again, I'd be interested to hear what you've got to say at the local level, where you feel that there is some strength in them. The accountability issue is one which I'm afraid is both evident in an STV system and in the first past the post system. You mentioned when you talk about this idea of transparency, accountability, the way citizens are understanding. And a lot of the public evidence is that citizens are still struggling to understand what governments do, even in a new political system. It doesn't tend to address that process of accountability. And I think the one thing that has emerged in Scotland, particularly if you look at the Scottish Electoral Commission work on this, is that there has been a problem with the greater complexity of the STV system, and some voters, particularly those that are disengaged, find that it is complex, it is in some ways confusing, and they haven't had that political education you talk about to allow them to understand the new system. Whether that is simply a case of a failure in some senses to be able to educate citizens to the new system, I'm not quite sure, but I'd be interested to see about what your thoughts are on that. And beyond that, I think there are some interesting points which both of you raised. And I think one of them is that, in some senses, there is a question about that relationship between national and local government and what are the implications of changing the electoral system. I'm interested in what you've got to say about how what are the experiences of Scotland, particularly about how the additional member system at the national level and how the STV system at the local level, have you noticed any distinction in the way in which people are relating towards that? I think some of the points that you were raising, Kevin, highlights that issue about intra-party issues. And in some senses, there are two clear problems which STV doesn't resolve. One is that local parliamentary representatives at the national parliament, whether it be at the Scottish Parliament or at the UK level, cross over in their remit with local councils, and there's always a confusion about what are the remits of representation, who are the representatives, and so there are problems with that. I wonder whether there are some ways in which you can talk about how do you challenge those intra-party tensions. You're mentioning that STVs are a problem in potential candidate tension. I wonder if at the same time there's a problem in the fact that the way in which local government and national government interact within party political framework is still problematic. Does that get resolved by STV, by political reform? One of my PhD students is currently doing a study on the Labour Party and the local authority and their relationship between national level. And one of the things that keeps coming out, the local councillors feel disempowered. They feel that national politics dominates the agenda, and it's very difficult to break through. And in a way, the question that sort of that relates to in some ways is, how do you create, has it energised that local political culture? If you notice the reform electoral system has energised, I think one of the problems in Manchester is that we tend not to have a very strong local media culture that talks about local politics in a way which would energise people to connect with it. The politics show gets 5-10 minutes of a programme to talk about local stuff, and then it's back to national, so it's always talk about the national rather than the local. And in some ways, the last question, which is one that goes to you, Kevin, which is about policy making. I think you're right that the Liberal Democrats haven't been particularly effective as an opposition. But what does that say about the process, if we have 95 out of 96, about this process of policy making? What's going to be the challenges under the first past the post system of a Labour Party in government? Having a conversation in itself at the local level that us, the citizens, can recognise as a deliberation about policy, or is it going to be seen simply as rubber stamping through? Is there a challenge with that? So I think those are the questions that I'd like to bring back to yourself. I don't know, Andy, if you want to go first.
Okay, I'll try and pick up some of those points that you've raised, Andy, and also some of the sort of points that Kevin raised in his contribution, which I found very interesting. And this is in no particular order, but I'll start with a couple of things that I've heard that I, frankly, don't agree with. What is wrong with intra-party issues being robust, difficult and challenging? I see nothing wrong with it whatsoever. I mean, I'm sort of personally fortunate that I'm in a 3-member ward and there's only one Labour candidate and now one Labour councillor. So I don't have these challenges, but I've got 6 wards where we've got 2 Labour councillors and a 4-member ward, and I've got 1 ward because of a death in a by-election which we won, where we've got 3 Labour councillors because the SNP councillor died and we won the by-election.
Could you, if you wanted to, have 3 candidates in a 3-member ward?
Yes, we can stand 4. We can stand 4. So you tend to stand to perceived strength of the vote, although there's a big debate and more anarchist elements of electoral reform sort of movement about whether you should do that or not do that, but we do tend to stand towards a perceived strength plus. And part of our change in tactics did benefit. That's why we went from 15 to 20 councillors in 2007 to 12. But I don't have a problem whatsoever with a bit of internecine conflict. I mean, what is wrong with that? What is wrong with competition amongst colleagues? I think it's entirely healthy. So I'm afraid I'm going to have to just reject that point. I think it's okay to have a bit of infighting. It's my job to manage that. I'm the boss of the Labour group, but it's my job to manage that infighting. Maybe infighting is the wrong phrase, but a bit of tension, a bit of argy-bargy. It's not bad if it's inside a group. And I think as long as it's managed and channeled in the proper way, it can be constructive. And I don't think STV alters that. If anything, it sort of structures it better. And you know, that competition that I've got in my 3-member ward with my Green councillor and my SNP councillor used to be a Tory, it's really, really challenging for me. And you know, if I was being completely tribal and partisan, I'll just be honest and say I don't like it because I've got to chase my tail all the time. And that is good. That is good. So I don't think STV hinders that or makes it worse or is problematic in that sense whatsoever. I think it's positive. The second thing, Andy, I mean, you possibly have a stronger academic bent on this than me, but I disagree with what you just said about STV and its understanding by electorate. I really strongly disagree with that. And this is where I might be in danger of losing half the audience with boring you to death about the intricacies of what happened, because there was a massive problem in 2007. It was not, because remember I said to you 990307, the two votes were on the same day. It was nothing to do with STV ballot paper. Nothing could be simpler than 1, 2, 3, 4, or 1, 2, or 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. What happened was they mucked about, all the parties in the Scottish Parliament colluded on this, they mucked about the AMS ballot paper. The AMS ballot paper in 1999 and 2003 were two separate ballot papers. So it was one for your constituency ballot paper for your constituency MSP and one for your regional list MSP. What they did in 2007 was they stuck the bloody two ballot papers onto one bit of paper. And it was a disaster, because so they had the regional list on one side, on the left-hand side, which most people go to first, the regional list, and then they had the individual ward on the right-hand side. And all the spoils, the high level of spoils, were in the Scottish Parliament elections, but the blame got heaped on the two elections being on the same day. There was nothing to do with that. I mean, I'd be interested to be outside this meeting, or even by email having a discussion about this, because the evidence I see is that it was the fault of the conjoining of the ballot papers, and that's why they did the 5 years, so they split. But they've now gone and split the ballot papers for AMS again. So in 2011, when the Scottish Parliament went to elect the polls, they had two separate ballot papers again for AMS. So I don't think there's a problem with voter understanding in STV. I really don't. But I'm interested in maybe, as I say, out with tonight, having a discussion with you about that. And then just in terms of agreement, I very strongly agree with many of the points that Kevin was making about the need for candidate selection being so crucial, political education post 16 I touched on in response to your earlier points, Andy. Opposition need to be ineffective. I mean, STV doesn't, I'm not claiming that STV magically solves all that. You have to have the change in political culture as well. And you're absolutely right, Andy, I think Kevin, you touched on this as well. I mean, it doesn't automatically mean more women. We've got a strong position earlier, we've got 40% females, but the SNP have got 2 out of 17, you know, that's under STV. It's the way that the candidates are selected, it's not the voting system that does that. And we have a twin arrangement as well. So I very strongly agree with all those points you made about, you know, the voting system isn't a magic bullet or a silver bullet or a magic wand for solving those issues. You need to work very hard at them separately. And then on the latter points, Andy, about weakness of coalition and energised local politics, I'm sure this comes across me. I am obviously in favour of single transferable vote, a very strong advocate of it. But trying to put that bias to one side, even, you know, I have experienced both systems for 8 years under first past the post and coming up with 10 years under STV. It has energised local politics. It really has. Not, you know, magnificently or incredibly. You know, we're not in some sort of nirvana in Scottish local government. Far from it. But it has definitely heightened the levels of debate. It's re-engaged local communities. And coalitions haven't been weak. I actually touched on one that had changed. I said that we were the only Labour SNP coalition in Scotland, and there's now a second one, Dumfries and Galloway. So there have been 1 or 2 administrations that have changed, but it's not the collapse and to and fro that many people foretold. You know, most of the coalitions have been relatively stable, and you know, even the coalition that I mentioned when I was in opposition from 7 to 12. The Lib Dem SNP coalition was stable for the whole 5 years. I mean, it had its moments, like we're having ours now.
Proven far more stable than in the Scottish Parliament.
Yeah, absolutely. So my evidence for what it's worth, or my view for what it's worth of the 2007 years coming in, by the time we were proposing in 2017, with 10 years of STV, is that the coalitions have been stable. It hasn't led to weak local government in any way, shape or form. And where there is weakness, it's more to do with individuals, principally council leaders being unable to manage the coalition process. It's not really to do with the voting system. So I would contest that it has definitely energised local politics in Scotland, and it hasn't led to weakness of or instability around coalitions. I think there's the final thing was just, I mean, again, Kevin touched on some of this, and you touched on it, Andy. There's something that you can do regardless, and I don't. Does Manchester, Keith's sitting here filming this, does Manchester webcast all its meetings? Because I mean, that's been really helpful for us. I mean, we sometimes have 5 people in the gallery at full council meetings, unless we're closing something or there's big budgets. There'll be 4 or 5 people, and 3 of them will be staff. And we're now getting close on 1,000 people watching our webcast of our full council meetings. Now, okay, that's 1,000 in a population of 500,000, but it's 995 more than we were getting 5 or 6 years ago. So just simple things like webcasting, we're moving to electronic voting, we have devolved all of our budgets, we've got 12 neighbouring partnerships, and we devolved our roads budgets down to those 12 neighbouring partnerships. But all of those things absolutely diddly squat to do with PR, and they can all be done under the first past the post. But a combination, I think, in Scotland of the electoral system being changed and really shaking things up, alongside some councils, and obviously I would contest Edinburgh as one of these, introducing a lot of radical change, has helped, I feel, bring a breath of fresh air to Scottish local politics. I hope that picks up most of the range.
No, that's good, yeah.
There were 2 points addressed to me. I remember the first one, but I forgot the second.
True.
If you could remind me of the second while I answer the first. The first was about the tension between local and national party, I think.
Yeah.
Something like that, yeah. So I'm currently, I'm sort of well versed in this. I'm currently standing for election for an internal party position on Labour's NEC, which is the National Executive Committee, and in theory is the ruling body of the Labour Party, for anybody who doesn't know that. In theory, anyway. I'm not quite sure how true that is. But there are 6 constituency places on that for sort of ordinary grassroots members. It's 33 people, so it's not a very big section, but you know. And in fact, just last night I was speaking to a local party meeting up in Lancashire in Transferable, and people were asking me about that disconnect. I mean, it comes up all the time within the party. Is both ordinary members and councillors that they don't feel listened to by the leadership, that they don't feel like we're involved in policy, yet we have to go out and implement it. And there's a real problem there. And you know, there is a very centralised policy process. It's not as bad as the Conservative Party, which doesn't have a policy process that members can engage in, but we do have a very centralised sort of process. And even though it's gotten better, the reality is that it is senior sort of MPs, it's members of the shadow cabinet or the cabinet when we're in government who make policy. Whether it doesn't matter what members or councillors say. Now it seems to be getting better. There's some innovations in local government. So I think Richard Leese, our council leader, is chairing a task force. Love these words. A task force to look at innovation in local government and the devolution of powers of local government. I get the feeling that's very much about giving power to councils and not so much about how we can devolve it further and look at community empowerment and the rest of it. So there's probably some stuff we've done there, but there is a real tension, and councillors in particular, who now are the single largest donor to the Labour Party, I think really feel like they don't get their money's worth in terms of how councillors can fit into that process. So I mentioned I'm standing for one of these 6 constituency places. Councillors formally get 2 places on that body through the Association of Labour Councillors, which until recently didn't exist, it just took our money. But there's now an executive committee of it, which in theory has some role in the process of sort of being a voice for local government. But yeah, could certainly do a lot more on that, I think. And yeah, there is an issue there.
Well, the second point was looking really at sort of the process of policy making. But I'm a great supporter of devolution, regional devolution across the England. And in a way, one of the problems with that, the resistance is that within the centralised Westminster mechanism, is that England is seen very different to the rest of the United Kingdom in party political terms. There's lots of talk, John Cruz was writing New Statesman a couple of days ago about the idea that we need to reach out, the Labour needs to do the big society better, we need to go and do lots of things you were talking about, policy forums, you're engaging with, citizens, all these things I think are fine. At the end of the day, the decisions are made in that building over there by elected councillors. And the problem that's going to be, possibly, is that 95 out of 96, how much internal debate, dispute? Sorry, I was going to sort of reach us out. This is the last sort of thing.
Well, it's an hour and a half. It's hot in here. Maybe other people are happy with that. But to me, it's just the same old people on the platform talking, and not engaging with the rest of the audience.
Well, I think perhaps we've not got to that stage.
Yeah.
Well, it's a very long time. It's very hot. We're intentional to have a break so people can get a glass of water.
Don't blame me, sir. I'm merely here to give pick up my time for public debate. I could be out watching Coronation Street on a Tuesday night.
No, we have got 3 people that come along. You know,
Yes.
some along the way.
Maybe it's me.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Oh, I'm sorry you feel that way, sir. I'm very sorry. I genuinely feel sorry.
I just think in terms
you give us about 5
Okay.
minutes. Give about 2 minutes. We'll probably get on and you can ask the first question.
I'll answer that very, very quickly.
Yes, thank you very much.
Which is that you're right that the decisions are made in the town hall or in the cabinet room or wherever, and they need to, it needs to go out. That can be done now, and there are people who advocate for this, and I hope and I think after next Thursday, we will be sitting down to have a really serious discussion about how we can show that we are not a one-party state and not a closed shop, and I hope that we will be coming up with some ideas to fix that. And I'd be really interested in, perhaps people in the room want to send things in by email, perhaps someone democracy wants to come up with some ideas, that we can kind of propose and discuss to make that a reality.
Well, as our dear departed friend was suggesting, there might be a need for a little bit more interaction. And seeing as we were mentioning the issues of gender, we should start with yourself first, and we shall come across that way, if that's okay. So, do you want to start?
That's me.
Yes,
Oh, right, okay. I thought it was fascinating. Yeah, it's a bit long, but absolutely fascinating because I've not heard. I wanted to hear what you want to say. That's the real concrete stuff. It's really fascinating to hear about the Manchester Council and then have the background and put it all together. So thank you very much for coming. I mean, in a way, and you are preaching to the converted up to a point, although it's really my 2 main points is about the position of women. I know that, as you said, the SDV or any PR doesn't necessarily involve women, and there's a much bigger question there. Maybe the bigger question is just the involvement of women, per se. And does that change in your experience the way politics operates? Fortunately, where I come from, we have a lot more women in politics than the macho crap of politics, and I'm sure not you wouldn't put us through that, but we do have a lot of older men and some young men in suits that actually make life terrible for women. And I'm not a wilting flower, but it still makes it very, very difficult and stops women wanting to participate. And I know that politics is the conflict I'm willing to argue, but that's not the point. And the second bit is this massive area that isn't to do with SDV or any kind of PR about participation. And are we all really romanticising participation in politics? When 8 people come out of it, I wouldn't have expected any more than that, unfortunately. It was ever thus up to a point. There are massive sociological and economic and cultural changes, consumerism, the technology. There are lots of things we need to look at, but we have to be elitist in politics up to a point because nothing can get done. And if we expect that, to mean trade unions and the working man in the workplace, I mean, there's so many that the changes are so vast that I think if we romanticise it, we will lose something really as well. And that just reminds me about the electoral, but the numbers of people that vote in local elections in Scotland, is that actually still not just more to do with Scotland than it is to do with SDV? The fact that you come from 44 to 42, and yet some places that, is that just to do with your electorate? And the things seem so much more important in Scotland in different ways. So I'm sorry.
We'll take one more round, we'll come back and do another round of questions later. Yes, sir.
Well, first, can I agree? I think all the contributions so far have been really fascinating. And I'm very glad the organisation that I represent in Lake West County is supporting the meetings. Very worthwhile. I've got 2 quick questions then. They'll be quick to ask. One is particularly Andrew's view on this. I've always feared that one of the effects of STV is to blur the dividing lines between parties, and this is very clearly what's happened in the Republic of Ireland, that it's very difficult to say which with Fine Gael or Fianna Fáil is more right-wing, because there's a natural tendency to fish for votes from other fish for second, third preferences from other parties, and the same. In fact, primaries can have the same effect in America. That you end up losing that clear distinction line. So if you give voters more control over the selection of candidates, then they lose the power to distinguish the parties. So has that happened? Second question is the difference in turnout, for instance, between Edinburgh and Manchester, is that to do with the voting system itself, or is it simply because STV implies a greater marginality, losability, if you like, a greater horse race effect between the parties? Because if it is simply the horse race effect, then a city like Manchester, which has got a big Labour majority, and we probably have hopefully have a Labour majority even with STV, will still have the need to kind of invent a way of engaging people without a horse race effect, because it's still going to be clear, even though they're not going to be an all-Labour council, there'll be a Labour majority council. So that the change to STV, while it will increase the losability, it won't get to the stage where it automatically increases the turnout.
Do you want to go first? Yeah, I mean, just mix and match the response with this, because I think the latter points that you both asked were about turnout and numbers in Scotland, and I think the only honest answer is that it's probably impossible to say with certainty that it has been STV that has led to that comparably positive picture in comparison to some of the English cities, because we don't have the longevity of evidence, because of the way that 99, 03 and 07 were all conjoined local council and Scottish Parliament. 012 was the first standalone local council election under STV in Scotland. So I won't really be able to opine on this with any sincerity until I get the figures for 017, because that will be the first comparison of a standalone local council election. And even then, that's just 2 elections, it's 1 cycle. It probably needs a bit more time for that to be asserted with any sort of definite sort of nature. I just don't think the length of evidence is there. That probably takes me back to your first point, Mark, which is about the issue of blurred lines, because I think in Southern Ireland there is that length of evidence, and I see what you've just described it as well, that there probably has been, I think, a blurring of the lines between some of the principal parties in Southern Ireland. Is that happening in Scotland? Again, I'm afraid I don't really know for certain. I mean, yes, of course, particularly in a city like Edinburgh, where there's a 5-party split, where we only have 20% of the vote, and even on a fantastic day, we get low 30s at the moment, we have to use your terminology, fish for the second and third preferences. We absolutely have to do that. But we had to do that under first past the post. In certain areas, we had to not fish for second preferences. We had to appeal to a broader spectrum because of the makeup of the city. Now, that wouldn't apply in Glasgow, or it wouldn't apply here in Manchester, I'm sure. But again, that blurring of the dividing lines could be happening in Scotland, in local government, but I think it's probably too early to say yea or nay to that question, I'm afraid. And then the other points you raised about participation of women and just general participation, I sort of tend to agree. We are in a representative democracy, we're not in a direct democracy, and we are still going to have elected members who make decisions. There is a small eliteness to that is unavoidable unless you go down the Swiss model and go for more direct democracy, and that has its role. But we are at the moment in a representative democracy. In terms of the gender issue, you mentioned this, Andy, the evidence is so far that it's been fairly static in terms of its impact on numbers of female elected councillors. It's not been bad, it's not been good. And I tend to think that it's other actions that are required. It's a whole different debate.
Yeah.
I'm in favour of positive action. You know, from what Kevin said, they're doing that here in Manchester. They've been doing it in Scotland for a long time, twinning seats, whether under ANS or under STV. It's that that's led to good percentages of female councillors in Edinburgh and in the Scottish Parliament. It's not STV or
Does that
ANS.
change the culture, having more women?
Oh, definitely.
Yeah.
Definitely. But it's not the electoral system that's
No,
that's done
does it
that.
change it for the better, in your
Oh,
estimate?
definitely.
How can you say anything else?
Unquestionably.
No, no.
Unquestionably. And it goes back to your point, Kevin, about having
Yeah.
there's simple things like just the atmosphere in the chamber when you've got your children in the chamber or more women can be as you know just as bad as men and grievous, you know. But in the main it changes the culture for the better. I'm very strong.
Just very quickly on that point. I think I think the last sort of 3 intakes in Manchester, there's been a lot more women and a lot more younger people. It's really starting very slowly to change the culture. Although it moves at a glacial pace here, but definitely changing it, and definitely for the better as well. It's a separate debate, but the positive action stuff is really important. But when you have 50% plus 1 seats that are only for women, and you're scrabbling around to find women to stand in them, then that says that you need to do something else. And I think that's the problem as well at the national level with your women's shortlist as well, is that the party is really, really good at delivering that in the short term without long-term thought to what's the point where we don't need it? What's the point where we've got loads of people coming forward and we don't have any sort of bias in how people are selected, and there isn't that groundwork being done, I think, to change the culture of politics and how it operates. The other point was the romanticisation. Well, turnout was higher, and there was a time when there were 1 million members of or 2 million members of the Labour Party. And wouldn't that be amazing to go back to now? And so it was partly romanticised, but it's partly based on fact. I was in Malta over Easter, and also Italy. But so 2 friends of mine are candidates for the European Parliament, one in each country, and I was in Malta and doing very limited campaigning because I don't speak Maltese. But thankfully they have English as an official language, so it wasn't too bad. It's just incredible. I mean, okay, fine. It's a small country and it has a population size of Manchester, but it's just bizarre. You just can't get your head around it being from it. People love politics and politicians. I mean, they actually love them. I was out with this guy who's not even elected yet. He's a European parliamentary candidate, and people were mobbing him in markets in the street and wanting pictures and wanting to say hello and wanting to take him home for a cup of tea and talk about issues. And it was just absolutely astonishing. Their turnout, they don't have mandatory voting. Their turnout in a general election, the last general election was 95%. I asked him what the turnout was going to be in the European elections. He said, "Oh no, it's not very good. It's 75%." We didn't even dream of that for general elections. It's just astonishing. And there's a whole. And I've written really. Well, it depends on your interest. But my website's kevpeel.co.uk, and I wrote a piece about sort of my campaigning experience in those 2 countries and what we might learn. I couldn't get anyone interesting to publish it because it's too long. It ended up just going off for one. It's about 2,000 words. But feel free to glance at it. At least it is extraordinary. There are things we can learn. But, there are things we can scale up and we can learn about how they do it there. And I don't think I'm being romanticised when I say that we shouldn't just sort of say, well, it can't be done, and people here just don't engage in politics, and that's that. Because I think elsewhere we can see how it is done, and also we can look to our sort of history to see when it was better than it is now.
I think it's into that golden age of democracy argument. If you look back to the 1950s, it's quantity versus quality. You've got quantity, but you've got very important qualities, tribal, class-based, very elitist.
It's never going to go back to that, is it?
No, I think that's the danger of it. But one day you should be chairlifted down here, don't you? Look, gentlemen, sorry.
Comments rather than questions. I hope you were being realistic rather than optimistic to say that Labour may get 3 next week. I'm thinking that UKIP may well do better than you hope. But the image I get of Manchester from 2 fora, one is Manchester Evening News correspondents, and the other is Manchester Confidential correspondents, which are 2 very different demographics. But the feeling that there isn't actually the openness and the discussion within the City Council, as you said, but in fact everything is vested in the leader and the Chief Executive. And you've not mentioned the Chief Executive once, and I think in Manchester is very, very strong. And it's epitomised by the Library Walk decision that was opposed by virtually everybody, but it went through, and other decisions like that. So, the person in the street, and people who are more politically active, like Manchester Confidential readers, tend to have the view that whatever you do, whatever you say, Richard Lees and Howard Bernstein will still decide.
Yeah. Okay. We can come in on that. Should we collect a couple of Yes, sir.
I was interested in your mention of whether with a coalition you can have strong government or not. Of course, the argument from Conservative and Labour down the ages against PR has been that you will end up with coalition and you won't have strong government. What we want is strong government. But what does strong government have done for us, on a national scale anyway? And if you look at perhaps the most successful country in Europe, Germany, they've had coalitions since, the year dot. So is it not better to have a weakish coalition rather than these headstrong, strong governments that lead us into disaster?
Yeah, I'll leave Kevin to come back on the Manchester points, but on that last point, obviously I couldn't agree more. I would characterise it more as what's wrong with a bit of compromise. Now, that might sound a little bit contrary to what I was saying earlier on about what's wrong with having a bit of managing inside groups and parties and so on. I don't think the two are mutually exclusive. And within our two groups, as you can well imagine, in Edinburgh, at the moment, between Scottish Labour, Edinburgh Labour and SNP, we have to have compromise by the bucket load. But is that so bad? I'm looking to get a deal across 38 heads instead of across a lot smaller number now, and across different political perspectives, which wouldn't be the same with a single party grouping that was running the city necessarily. But I do think a lot of it does, I think I mentioned this, it does come down to individuals as well. The party leaders, I suppose, linking into the first point, are important. Even if the party leaders don't have a style that is conducive to, and I'm not making a comment on what the situation is in Manchester because I don't know it that well, but if the party leaders don't have a style that's conducive to that a possibility of compromise, then it does create difficulties, even under a proportional representation. But I agree with you personally, I have no difficulty with a
strong leader of this type under your system could still do damage.
Of course, absolutely, of course. I'm being very frank about the fact that it's not magic wand or silver bullet.
Accountable under STV after making a decision like that.
Oh yeah.
After railroading through something that was unpopular, they would be more accountable.
Yeah, at a local level, I touched on this.
I'm not saying.
Even as council leader, I really do have to watch my back in my local ward, and that is a good thing. Even though it's difficult.
So the Manchester point. Where's the camera? So I think having we've seen really dysfunctional local government in some places in the UK where you have there are lots of places where the council is run by officers, and it's obvious. And it's obvious when you in different jobs I've had, I've sort of been responsible for sort of meeting councillors, for example, and talking about issues. You can always tell when they turn up with 3 officers, that you're in a council that's run by the officers really, and the officers, you sort of look to the officers before the answer, or the officers give the answers, and the council just sat there sort of on the biscuit. We're not one of those, and I think how the sort of partnership between Richard and Howard has delivered great success for the city, and I think it's impossible to argue that isn't true. I think reading comments on the Manchester Confidential website is a route to insanity. I've stopped every time I'm on there. I've stopped reading any comments because they're just mad. But but you're right. There is the occasion for things like that to happen, which wouldn't necessarily not happen under STV. I oppose the balmy £3 million conservatory in Library Walk. and you know, supported residents in that and spoke up at the various points as well against my own leader, which you know is difficult and ruined my chances of ever getting ahead in the government. But you know, that was an important decision to my constituents, and I agreed with them, and we did it. I don't think that's about the voting system. That's about what I said before about where power lies and how you get the public more involved in that process. I think planning is in particular.
And have soul, which is the public image. They don't see all that you've talked about tonight. They just see those almost dictatorial decisions.
Well, see, you say that, but you know, the satisfaction surveys, which are done, I think, on a monthly basis, so they're done very, very regularly. People are incredibly satisfied with the services they receive from the council, and in national polls, I think support for local government is something like 70%. People, and I think that is important because you know, and that lessens the further away you get from people. You know, by the time you get to Europe, obviously, you know, we see where we are with that now. So I think on the whole, well, we wouldn't keep winning elections. I mean, if people really felt really strongly, even under this system, that the Labour Council in Manchester didn't listen to people and wasn't doing its job, we would not have the Lib Dem leaflets that say that would have more traction, and they would be keeping some of their seats. I think there's been a reputation locally of Labour really standing up for Manchester, and you know, even when Labour was in government saying, well, we don't agree with this, and you're all nuts, and you shouldn't be doing this, and shouldn't be doing that. You know, I think there's been a real sort of radical tradition in some ways. Now, you know, can we make improvements? Well, definitely, and you know, off camera we can talk about that. But I don't think it's necessarily sort of as you know as depicted by the recent Manchester Confidential.
Yeah.
I'm not sure that there's many places outside of the Daily Mail comments section where such vitriol is poured on
search for me, shouldn't things to say about me.
Yes, unfortunately I've read some things about you. It's true. I think it's a real interesting question because strong leadership is both lauded and at the same time is seen to be a weakness, and at the same time intra-party deliberation is seen to be a weakness and a strength. And it's finding that mixture between the two, the balance between the two. And I think at a local level, one of the problems is that there's a mimicking. What's happened, particularly since the reform of local government in England and New Labour, is that local government is acting more and more like national government. And so even if you have a leader cabinet system, what you're tending to find is the executive is aggregating power. I can say that, maybe you wouldn't want to say that. And the evidence is there, the research is there, that local government is acting more like national government. How you break that cycle, well, I'm not quite sure, but I don't think it's simply reforming the electoral system itself. It's a wider change in the way in which government is structured.
But the effect is not that people should, why don't they vote Liberal or for the opposition here? I think it means that less people vote. That's the effect.
See, I don't agree because you yourself, with respect to all, you're in Lee, we're in Lee here, a handful of people that are passionate about politics. So most people, you might have passionately disagreed with the tunnel thing, whatever it was, you know, and you supported that.